The silence that settled across the grand ballroom arrived so suddenly that even the musicians stopped playing for a heartbeat, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. Moments earlier, my uncle had been entertaining nearly 50 guests with another joke about how I had wasted my life chasing government adventures. But everything changed when an elderly man seated beside him slowly rose from his chair and stared at me with a look of disbelief that made every conversation disappear. "What did you say your identification code was?" the old man asked with a trembling voice that carried far more weight than anyone expected. And when I calmly replied, "Silver Falcon," the color drained from his weathered face before he whispered, "That cannot be possible, because the person behind that name was never supposed to become a public story." My uncle laughed awkwardly, assuming the stranger had misunderstood something, but the veteran ignored him completely and spoke words that left every guest frozen in place. "Sir, the woman sitting across from you has carried the lives of hundreds on her shoulders while you spent years believing she was simply another office employee. My name is Natalie Brooks, and for 12 years I served as a flight commander in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Although very few people outside military circles ever knew what my real responsibilities involved. The gathering that evening had been arranged to celebrate my uncle Richard's 65th birthday at a historic mountain lodge near Banff, where friends, relatives, former co-workers, and neighbors filled the beautifully decorated hall without realizing they were about to witness a family secret that had remained buried beneath military silence for almost a decade. I arrived almost an hour late because thick snowfall had delayed commercial flights into Calgary, forcing me to rent a vehicle and drive through icy mountain roads before finally reaching the lodge with little more than an overnight bag and a tired smile. I wore a simple charcoal sweater, dark trousers, and an old wristwatch my late mother had given me before graduating from officer training, because I had never cared about expensive clothes or making dramatic entrances, even though my relatives often mistook quiet confidence for a lack of ambition. As soon as I stepped inside, my cousin Ethan crossed the room with a welcoming grin and embraced me warmly before whispering that Uncle Richard had already been telling exaggerated stories about everyone in the family, except me, which unfortunately was exactly what I expected from him. Ever since I had chosen military service instead of joining the family's construction business, my uncle treated my career as though it were a temporary hobby that would eventually fade away.
The evening settled into a comfortable rhythm as waiters carried steaming dishes from table to table, laughter echoed beneath the wooden beams of the lodge, and snow drifted softly beyond the enormous windows overlooking the frozen mountains. I slipped quietly into my seat near the end of the long dining table, hoping to enjoy the celebration without becoming the subject of another conversation, but experience had taught me that family gatherings rarely unfolded so peacefully. Uncle Richard raised his glass with a broad smile and welcomed everyone before his attention landed on me, his expression immediately changing into the familiar mixture of amusement and criticism that I had known since childhood. "Well, Natalie finally escaped her mysterious government paperwork long enough to remember she has relatives," he joked loudly enough for everyone to hear, and several guests laughed politely while I simply smiled and wished him a happy birthday without allowing his words to disturb my composure. As dinner continued, conversations shifted from business and sports to travel, retirement, and the future of the younger generation, until one of my uncle's longtime neighbors turned toward me with genuine curiosity and asked what kind of work kept me away from home for months at a time. Before I could answer, Uncle Richard waved his hand dismissively and replied, "She mostly trains new pilots on simulators and handles military paperwork these days. Nothing too exciting," causing several people to nod as though the matter had already been settled despite the fact that none of it was true. I gently placed my fork beside my plate and answered with a calm voice, "Actually, I still fly operational aircraft whenever duty requires it," and the table grew noticeably quieter as a few guests exchanged surprised glances while my uncle chuckled as though I had made an amusing exaggeration. Sitting only 2 chairs away was the elderly veteran named Colonel Arthur Bennett, a retired special operations officer who had remained mostly silent throughout the evening. Yet the moment he heard my response, his eyes narrowed with sudden interest, as though an old memory had quietly awakened after years of silence. Uncle Richard leaned back comfortably and smirked before asking in a playful tone, "If you're still flying important missions, then tell us something only real military pilots would know. What identification code do they actually call you?" I hesitated for only a brief second before answering honestly, "Silver Falcon," and the instant those two words left my mouth, Colonel Bennett's coffee cup slipped from his trembling fingers onto the table with a sharp sound that silenced every voice in the room as he stared directly at me and whispered, "After all these years, it was you?" Colonel Bennett slowly pushed his chair back and stood without taking his eyes off me, his weathered face reflecting the kind of shock that only comes from recognizing a memory once believed impossible to revisit. Every conversation around the table faded into complete silence as dozens of curious faces shifted between the retired officer and me, wondering why a simple identification code had transformed an ordinary birthday dinner into something neither laughter nor small talk could repair. Uncle Richard forced an uneasy smile and looked around the room as though expecting someone else to explain the strange reaction, but nobody spoke because the tension had become almost tangible. "Arthur, surely you're mistaken," he said with an awkward chuckle. "Natalie has always worked around aircraft, but you're acting as if she commanded an entire war." And the veteran answered without even glancing in his direction, "No, Richard, I'm acting like a man who has just recognized the voice that saved dozens of lives when every other option had already disappeared." A heavy silence settled over the lodge while snow continued falling outside, making the warmth inside the hall feel strangely distant, as everyone waited for someone to break the moment. Colonel Bennett looked at me with quiet respect before asking, "Were you ever assigned to Operation Northern Eclipse?" And although I kept my expression calm, I simply replied, "I'm not permitted to discuss classified missions," a response that confirmed far more than a direct answer ever could. The veteran slowly nodded, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and drew a long breath before speaking to the room in a voice filled with memories that had clearly never left him. 9 years ago, our multinational rescue team became trapped deep inside the Arctic after an intelligence mission collapsed. Our communications failed during a violent blizzard, fuel was running low, several men were badly injured, and headquarters informed us that reaching our position before sunrise was considered nearly impossible because the storm had grounded almost every available aircraft, he explained, while every guest listened in complete silence and my uncle's confident smile gradually disappeared. When hope had almost vanished, a calm female pilot contacted us over an emergency frequency and said, "Remain exactly where you are. Silver Falcon has located your position and rescue is on the way," Colonel Bennett continued, his voice growing softer as forgotten emotions resurfaced across his face. Against every recommendation, she flew through freezing winds that experienced pilots refused to enter, guided 3 rescue helicopters through near-zero visibility, remained above us for hours while coordinating every movement from the sky, and because of her decisions, every single member of our team returned home alive to their families instead of becoming names engraved on a memorial wall. For several long seconds, no one around the table uttered a single word because the weight of Colonel Bennett's story seemed almost too great to comprehend inside a room that had been filled with birthday laughter only moments earlier. My younger cousins stared at me with wide eyes. The older guests exchanged uncertain glances, and even the waitstaff paused discreetly near the kitchen entrance as though they sensed they were witnessing something far beyond an ordinary family gathering. Uncle Richard slowly reached for his glass of iced tea instead of whiskey this time, buying himself a few moments to process what he had just heard before forcing another skeptical smile that failed to hide the growing uncertainty in his expression. "Arthur, I respect your service more than you know," he said carefully, "but memories can become larger over time, and people often give too much credit to one person when an entire team deserves recognition," causing several guests to lower their eyes, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Colonel Bennett's face remained calm, yet there was unmistakable firmness in his voice when he replied, "A successful mission always belongs to the entire team, but there are rare moments when one person's courage becomes the reason the rest of the team survives long enough to do their part." He turned toward me with quiet admiration and added, Captain Brooks never spoke to us as though she were performing something extraordinary. She simply gave clear instructions, accepted impossible risks without hesitation, and stayed with us until the final helicopter disappeared safely beyond the storm. I looked down at the silver watch resting on my wrist, gently brushing my thumb across the worn leather strap that my mother had fastened around my arm on the day I graduated from officer training many years earlier. She had always believed in me without asking for medals, newspaper headlines, or dramatic stories, writing letters before every deployment that reminded me not to prove my worth to the world, but to remain the kind of person who could sleep peacefully after making difficult decisions. Advice that had guided me through every dangerous mission, far more than any flight manual ever could. The room remained wrapped in thoughtful silence until my cousin Ethan quietly broke it by asking the question everyone else seemed afraid to voice. "Natalie," he said gently, "if everything Colonel Bennett is saying is true, why did none of us ever hear even a small part of these stories?" And after taking a slow breath, I finally looked around the table before answering. Because some promises are signed with more than ink, and there are moments in military service when protecting other people's lives means accepting that your own story may never be told while you're still living it. My answer settled over the room with a quiet weight that no one seemed willing to disturb, and for the first time that evening, the attention of every guest shifted away from curiosity and toward genuine respect for a life they had never taken the time to understand. Uncle Richard remained silent for several moments before clearing his throat, but the confidence that had fueled his earlier jokes had begun to fade beneath the growing realization that he had spent years judging someone whose world he had never truly known. "I still don't understand," he finally admitted, folding his hands together on the table. "If your work was really that important, why didn't anyone in the family ever know about it?" I met his eyes calmly and replied, "Because the people I served beside trusted me to protect information that could endanger lives if it became public, and keeping that promise mattered more to me than receiving praise at family dinners or proving that I deserved anyone's approval." Colonel Bennett slowly reached into the inside pocket of his old blazer and removed a small leather wallet, carefully unfolding it until he revealed a faded photograph whose edges had become worn from years of being carried everywhere he went. He placed it gently on the table for everyone to see, and the picture showed a group of exhausted rescue personnel standing beside a snow-covered aircraft after the Arctic operation, while one figure near the cockpit had her face partially hidden beneath winter gear. Yet the Silver Falcon emblem stitched onto the flight suit was unmistakable. "I've carried this photograph for nearly a decade," Colonel Bennett said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude rather than nostalgia. "Because every anniversary of that mission reminds me that my grandchildren know their grandfather today only because a pilot they never met refused to abandon complete strangers during the worst storm any of us had ever seen." As the photograph passed from one pair of hands to another, disbelief slowly gave way to admiration, and for the first time in many years, I realized that the truth no longer needed to defend itself because it was finally being seen for what it had always been. Before anyone could say another word, the front entrance of the lodge opened and a wave of icy mountain air swept across the room as a hotel manager hurried inside with an expression that immediately caught everyone's attention. Looking directly at me, he spoke respectfully and said, "Captain Brooks, I'm sorry to interrupt the celebration, but there are several senior military officers waiting outside, and they insist they need to speak with you immediately because they say the matter cannot wait another minute." A wave of confused whispers spread through the ballroom as every guest instinctively turned toward the entrance, where the hotel manager stood patiently waiting for my response, while snowflakes drifted through the open doorway behind him. I quietly excused myself from the table and walked across the polished wooden floor, feeling dozens of eyes following every step as my relatives struggled to understand why senior military officers would travel to a private birthday celebration in the middle of a winter evening. The freezing mountain air greeted me as I stepped outside, where 3 dark military vehicles were parked beneath the glowing entrance lights with their engines idling softly against the silent backdrop of snow-covered pine trees. A tall woman wearing the insignia of an Air Vice Marshal approached me with measured confidence, saluted crisply, and said, "Captain Brooks, I apologize for interrupting your personal time, but headquarters has requested your immediate assistance regarding a developing international emergency that requires your experience." I returned the salute automatically before answering, Ma'am, I officially retired from Operational Command 18 months ago, so I'm surprised headquarters believes I'm the right person for this assignment. The Air Vice Marshal nodded respectfully and replied, "Normally, we would never disturb a retired officer, but this situation involves an evacuation mission through conditions remarkably similar to Operation Northern Eclipse, and after reviewing every available specialist, your name remained at the very top of the recommendation list." Through the lodge windows, I could see my family watching from inside, their faces filled with disbelief as they witnessed uniformed officers treating me with a level of respect they had never imagined I had earned during my years of service. Uncle Richard stood closest to the glass with his shoulders lowered and his expression completely different from the confident smile he had worn earlier that evening, as if every assumption he had built about my life was quietly collapsing one piece at a time. I took a slow breath while looking toward the snow-covered mountains stretching endlessly beneath the night sky, knowing that the peaceful evening I had hoped to spend with my family had suddenly become something far more significant than a birthday celebration. Turning back to the Air Vice Marshal, I answered with calm determination. "If there are lives depending on experience I can still offer, then I'll listen to the briefing first and make whatever decision best serves the people who need help." Unaware that my choice in the next few minutes would lead everyone inside that lodge to discover an even greater truth about sacrifice, leadership, and the quiet price of a life devoted to serving others. The Air Vice Marshal led me toward the largest vehicle, where a portable digital map had already been unfolded across the hood beneath a bright tactical light, illuminating a chain of remote islands battered by a powerful winter cyclone in the North Atlantic. She explained that a scientific research station had suffered a catastrophic communications failure after an earthquake triggered massive ice slides across the surrounding terrain, leaving dozens of researchers, engineers, and medical staff stranded with rapidly diminishing supplies while severe weather prevented conventional rescue aircraft from reaching them safely. Several senior officers gathered around the map as one intelligence specialist pointed toward a narrow flight corridor hidden between towering cliffs and unstable weather systems, describing it as the only remaining route capable of reaching the isolated station before another storm sealed the area completely. "Every pilot we've consulted agrees the approach is extremely dangerous," he admitted honestly. "But your previous mission demonstrated an ability to make sound decisions under conditions that most experienced crews consider impossible, and headquarters believes your guidance could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a national tragedy." Inside the lodge, the guests watched through the large windows as military personnel briefed me with obvious respect, and the atmosphere that had once been filled with music and celebration now carried a quiet sense of awe that no one could have imagined only an hour earlier. Uncle Richard slowly lowered himself into a chair without saying a word, remembering every joke he had made about my career over the years, while Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder because he could see the regret slowly replacing the pride that had long prevented his father from truly listening. After nearly 20 minutes, the briefing concluded, and the Air Vice Marshal thanked me for carefully reviewing every operational detail before asking whether I would be willing to return temporarily as a special strategic advisor for the mission. I looked once more toward the warm lights shining from inside the lodge before answering, "If my experience can help bring every one of those people home safely, then you already know my answer." And a quiet smile appeared on the faces of the officers because they had expected nothing less from someone whose greatest victories had always been measured by the lives she protected rather than the recognition she received. As I walked back toward the entrance, I realized the evening had changed something far more important than my family's opinion of my career, because for the first time they had begun to understand that true service is rarely loud, glamorous, or performed for applause. I gently opened the lodge door and stepped back inside, unaware that the conversation waiting for me with Uncle Richard would become the most difficult and emotional mission I had ever faced, not in the skies above frozen mountains, but within the walls of my own family. When I stepped back into the lodge, every conversation immediately faded as my family watched me with expressions that had completely replaced judgment with uncertainty, respect, and quiet anticipation. Uncle Richard slowly stood from his chair, walked toward me without his usual confidence, and admitted in a voice barely above a whisper, "I spent years believing I understood what success looked like, but Tonight I realized I never truly understood the woman standing in front of me. I looked at him for a long moment before answering with complete honesty, explaining that I had never expected medals, applause, or endless praise because the only recognition that ever mattered was knowing people returned safely to the families waiting for them at home. Uncle Richard lowered his head and confessed that after my parents divorced, he had convinced himself that keeping emotional distance was easier than admitting he had been wrong about my dreams. And with tears forming in his eyes, he quietly apologized for every joke, every dismissal, and every opportunity he had wasted to simply ask how I was doing instead of assuming he already knew. Colonel Bennett stepped forward with a gentle smile and placed a reassuring hand on Uncle Richard's shoulder before reminding everyone that true courage was measured not only by surviving impossible missions, but also by finding the humility to admit painful mistakes and repair broken relationships before time made that impossible. Inspired by his words, the atmosphere inside the lodge slowly changed as relatives gathered around me with genuine curiosity instead of assumptions, asking about my years of service, the friendships I had built, the sacrifices shared by military families, and the responsibility of making life-changing decisions while remaining invisible to the public. Early the following morning, I departed with the military team to assist in planning the international rescue operation, and although the mission remained classified for many months, news eventually confirmed that every scientist, engineer, and medical worker trapped at the remote research station had been evacuated safely without the loss of a single life. When I finally returned home weeks later, I discovered that my greatest reward was not another commendation waiting inside an official envelope, but a handwritten letter from Uncle Richard thanking me for teaching him that genuine heroes rarely seek attention because they measure success by the lives they protect rather than the applause they receive. Life gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Yet our family was never quite the same because respect had replaced assumptions, conversations had replaced silence, and understanding had replaced years of quiet misunderstanding that no one had known how to heal until that unforgettable winter evening. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.